All right, well, hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin. This is Gospel Simplicity, and I am so glad that you're here today because today we have a very exciting episode for you. I am joined today by Justin Khoe. He is a Christian YouTuber, podcaster, speaker. His videos have reached quite literally millions of people, and perhaps the most exciting thing about Justin is that him and his wife Emily are now expecting their first child in, I believe you said it was April, right?
That's correct. Yeah, April will be
Awesome.
our first one. We're so stoked. Brand new season of life, and we're ready for it.
That's so exciting, Justin. I am so glad that you are here. And we were just talking a little bit before, but for those that weren't privy to that conversation, Justin is actually someone that I was watching before I ever started making YouTube videos. One of the first Christian content creators I saw and thought, this is really cool. Like, you can use the internet to reach so many people. So doing this conversation is a true joy. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Austin. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, Justin, for those that aren't familiar with you, would you mind just giving a little bit of your story, your background, and how you've gotten to where you are today?
Yeah, so right now I run a channel under my name, Justin Khoe, and the goal of this is to create a space where we have conversations. I guess I should preface it, explicit conversations on belief and the stories that shape them. And the way that I got there was actually I did several years of ministry, over a decade of ministry, kind of more traditional stuff. I actually was teaching at a Bible college for one season. And while I was there, I met a young man by the name of Michael Troinosky III. And what was interesting about him was the way that he came to faith, the way that he became a Christian was actually through a YouTube video. In context, this was, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. So there wasn't a channel like Gospel Simplicity. There wasn't that Christian vlogger or anything else like that. So it really was like a no-name person. It was just someone out there with maybe 100 followers kind of a thing, just talking about their walk with God. And yet it was enough to convince him that, he wanted to follow after Jesus. And when I heard that idea, it blew my mind because I'm here putting in all this work to preach in churches that are, let's say, 100, 200, maybe 300 people at the max. I'm putting in all these hours of preparation for a classroom that has 11 students. And so it's just like, well, it seems kind of obvious to put that same energy towards the internet and maybe reach twice as many as that. Maybe I'll reach 25 people through the internet or 100 people through the internet. And that was kind of like the naivety of that season, but just ended up going all in on this kind of a thing. 10 months later, ended up quitting my job. We've been doing it full time ever since. And that's actually a really misleading version of the story. When I quit my job, I think I had, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred subscribers. It wasn't making money. It was very
Wow.
much a faith journey. It was just something I really felt led by God to do. So I don't want to say like, oh, we went viral and then we had all this money and it was perfect. Like, no, I think the first couple of years of doing YouTube related content, I didn't pull in an income, and it was up to my wife to actually support the vision that we believe that God had set out before us. And so all that to say, we've been doing it now for several years, and it's been a joy. And I feel more confident now that this is something that God is calling me to do than I did when I first started. I think with COVID in the background, it's kind of an obvious thing. But even before COVID, I really feeling that what I was doing was important, that it was meaningful, and that God was using it. And so it's been a really fun journey.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I want to give credit to where credit is due. Shout out to your wife for being so supportive in that journey. I can only, it's one thing to tell that story and just kind of go quickly through those sentences, but I have to imagine that was such a big transition for you all.
It was huge. I mean, I quite literally came home one day, and told my wife, like, I feel like God's made it clear it's time for me to go all in on the YouTube thing, which, that's cool. Like, I was doing YouTube for, 10 months up to that point. And it was something that was consuming a lot of time, but there was no reason for it to be successful, not in any financial sense. And so my wife, to her credit, took like 1 or 2 deep breaths and kind of was just like, all right, like, let's go for it. And she believed from the very beginning. And, if it wasn't for her support, there's definitely no way that we would be where we are today.
Wow. Well, that's fantastic. That's so encouraging to hear and such an awesome story. And for many of my listeners, they might be, if they're not familiar with their content, what the reason with your content, I mean, something I'm so excited about this episode is so often I'm bringing on Christians of various traditions, and I want to talk about that a little. But what I really want to talk about with you today is actually what underlies this whole project of what I'm doing, of this idea of loving across the lines, because I think that's something that you do so well. And I just love to learn from that a little bit. And recently, your channel took a bit of a shift in a way. So you were that Christian vlogger, and then you really rebranded the whole thing and went in a completely different direction. What inspired that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like this perfect storm of circumstances. I think at the heart of it, really just feeling like this is what God was calling me to do. So I think that's like always my North Star. It's one thing to have a channel that's growing and successful. It's another thing to be willing to completely throw all of that away and try something new. But, at the end of the day, I really felt like God was leading in that direction. Kind of the more periphery reasons was, when I first started YouTube, there weren't very many faith-based, if any, faith-based YouTubers. Like we were talking about our mutual, I don't know, I guess, friend on the internet, John Jorgensen, kind of one of the pioneers in this space. But when I started, he was one of maybe literally half a dozen people. And then kind of when I got to the stage of rebranding, it seems like there's dozens, if not hundreds of, faith-based content. And so there wasn't as big of a need of what I was doing anymore. I think also part of it is just kind of getting a little bit bored of what I was creating content about. You find yourself in this space where you feel like you've said all you can say on a particular subject, and yet my audience still wanted more of that subject, like the Christian dating or Christian advice videos. And it's kind of like not super interested in doing that anymore. Since I've already made maybe 100 videos on the subject, like let's kind of move on and let's grow and let's try something new. But one of the major things was, I live here in Portland, Oregon area, and it's a really eclectic place. A lot of really interesting people.
Yeah.
Keep Portland I think one weird. Of the one of the slogans is keep Portland weird. And you see that, like there's a lot of weird people out here, but just beautiful people. And so one of several stories, but one of the stories that stood out is I met this barber. My previous barber had retired, so to speak, and I needed a new person to cut my hair. And I walk in the store or walk in the barbershop and I meet Chico. And Chico's covered in tattoos. He's got like a really colorful language and has 1,000,001 stories to tell. One time I went into this for the haircut, and he's telling me about his mother back in Texas was a bank, or his grandmother back in Texas was a bank robber. And like they were part of like the mafia of Texas, like organized crime, like managing like all these different gangs. And it was just like, whoa, okay, cool. He talks about the times that the several years that he spent in prison because he sold meth to the feds. And I'm like, oh my goodness. He talks about his journey down to South America, to Iquitos, Peru, an actual spot where I've actually been on a mission trip before. And he talks about being around the bonfire. You have? Oh, okay. There you go.
That's so
apparently
cool.
It's a big spot for missions. I don't know if you were there for a mission or not, but
Anyway,
he talks about being around the. Yeah, no worries. He talks about being around the bonfire and doing an ayahuasca service with a shaman and having out of body experiences and all like just like wild things that like I don't know what to do with. I grew up in a Christian home, went to a Christian school, just kind of. For all intents and purposes, a sheltered life. And here's the guy that's putting a razor blade to my throat, for haircuts and shaves. And it just feels like I'm out of my depth, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. And yet all in the middle of that feeling compelled to move towards this relationship. And he's one of several people that stand out, but it's just this realization that God is putting people in my path that don't fit what I expect to be normal. They don't fit a traditional box. They don't like have a story that I can relate with. And yet I'm starting to see this more and more and more. And so putting like all these pieces and a few others together, I just feel like God is calling me into a space that I haven't really trafficked in before. And it felt really scary and daunting, but also really good. At the heart of my being is kind of this kind of evangelist in nature of sorts. I actually served as an evangelist for a number of years. Um, and so I was thinking, like, I'm putting all this time on YouTube, but I'm really just speaking to the choir, so to speak, and not really fulfilling what I feel called here to do, which is to bring the gospel to people who maybe have never heard it before. And so just being willing to step into that and just own that this is what God was calling me to do.
That's wonderful. And I will be sure to link to some of your videos that you have out with him because they are fascinating. And I think people will really enjoy them. I want to backtrack a little bit to something that you mentioned in there, that this isn't something you grew up with. You grew up in what you described as a fairly sheltered experience, or like a Christian bubble. And I really appreciate you saying that, because I think so many people out there think to do these things, you need to be a certain type of person and have a certain type of experiences growing up. But for me, I went to a Christian school. I'll leave that to people that understand it better. But that wasn't your case. So where was it that you got this zeal for ministry and for evangelism and this willingness to, as we would say on this channel, love across the lines or engage with people who are different than you?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't something that I grew up with, but it was kind of one of those things where you get baptized with fire, so to speak.
Yeah.
After I graduated from high school, I ended up doing this ministry where we would go door to door and like sell Christian books. Like I did the actual door to door salesman thing for 10 years.
Wow.
So in that time, I've knocked on over 100,000 doors. I've got to have conversations with all kinds of people from different backgrounds and things like that. And it's one of those things that's never necessarily comfortable, but you grow and you get better at it. And I don't know. It's just one of those things that I'll say when I was in high school, I was really going through what I guess I would use the label depression. Looking back on it, a lot of things were going well in my life. School was good. I had relationships that I thought were meaningful, sports, music, the whole thing. And yet there was this kind of lingering unhappiness with life. I kind of resigned myself to like a really mediocre existence. People would always ask, "Oh, what are you going to do when you graduate from high school?" And I never had an answer. There was nothing that I was excited to do, and so I figured I'd go into the family business. My dad's owns a dental practice in California, and I just knew that whatever I would do, I would be miserable at doing. And so I figured if I'm going to be miserable, I might as well make decent money, kind of a thing. And to me, the easiest way to do that was to become a dentist, which is really problematic because I more or less cheated my way through every science class since like the 7th grade. So I knew nothing about science. I could not figure it out. Like I hated science, and yet this is like the life that I resigned myself to. So when I, after high school, end up on this kind of mission experience in a roundabout way, it was the first thing that really I'm excited about this. Like this matters to me. Like it was through that season that like Jesus became real to me as like in a personal way. So that was like exciting all at once, but then also the joy I got to see when I got to share that with someone else. And so that's kind of what led me down the route of wanting to see how do I live my life in a way that is of service to Christ and to people. And so, all the steps to get to doing it on YouTube was just this logical like outflow of like, well, if this is what I want to serve my life doing, this is the way I could be potentially the most effective way of doing it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's such a healthy way to get into YouTube. Not that I'm some YouTube sage now, but having done it for, I guess, 2 years with hardly anyone watching, I can say if I did it just because I was waiting to have like a big audience, I would have quit a long time ago. But I think when I talk to people that do YouTube and love doing it, it's the people that just do it as an extension of what they love doing. And it's just a way to reach more people with that. So that's encouraging to hear.
I think that's super important. People get started on the internet for for a multitude of reasons. And I don't even want to say that those reasons are bad per se. I mean, you got to put money, or you got to put money on the table. You got to put food on the table. You got to be able to earn a living. And I guess, social media is a good a way as any. But I think you're right, specifically when it comes to faith-based content. It's not like a booming niche. It's not the kind of thing that you get rich off of. And so it definitely is, you do it because you believe in it. You do it because it's something that matters. And the reality is right now, I would still have the kinds of conversations that I'm having, even if there was no YouTube channel for it. It's still something that I'm deeply invested in. And, I've been doing YouTube now for like four years, coming up on 5 years. And it's only been in the last year that it's actually become sustainable. So for the first 4 years, it was at a deficit. Like, it cost me money to create content.
Yeah.
And so it very much is a mission-driven thing.
Yeah, I can relate to the former half of that. But we'll see about the latter.
You're blowing up, and I think that what you're doing is awesome, and people are resonating with it. So I think
Thanks.
If you keep on at it, like, I think it'll happen.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. And I should say thanks to all the patrons out. Like, I do eat. I'm doing fine. But yeah. Anyway, thanks so much for sharing that. And, before we get a little more into kind of the weeds of all this, I do want to ask kind of one more background question for you that I think my audience will find interesting, because it's a very eclectic audience, at least within the Christian tradition. You are Seventh-day Adventist, is that correct?
Yeah.
And
born and raised in an Adventist church, still mostly identify as a Seventh-day Adventist. Okay. Which there's some nuancing that's important to me, but yeah, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist.
Nice. And I don't know that much about the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, but would you say that had a big influence on this kind of evangelical passion you had, or kind of tangential, or like how does that relate, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so Adventism is pretty evangelical in nature, and I guess when I'm using that term, because I don't always know the full context that people bring to the table when they hear the word evangelical, what they're thinking of. What I mean is that Adventists care very much about preaching the gospel, and to the extent that we're, I think, like one of the most widespread denominations in the world. We have missions in nearly every country of the world. Like in America, Adventism is the most diverse ethnically church in America. It's something that is kind of a real rich part of our tradition, and our heritage is something that we're really proud about. My great grandfather, for example, in the Philippines was a church planter, and started many churches in the Philippines. Like, it's in our blood to be able to preach the gospel and all those different kinds of things. And so yeah, I think that as I started to embrace faith in a personal sense, this was definitely something that was encouraged. But it's also kind of like one of those catch-22 things where it's like, yeah, like you do all the things that Christians are supposed to do. You go to church, you pay your tithe, you pray, you do all the things that good Christians ought to do. But there was also like this kind of like tension in which I was supposed to live this calling out. And so, for those who are only listening or who maybe are blind, like, I'm Asian. And so kind of part of my cultural heritage is like education. You become a doctor, you become a nurse, or something along those lines. The idea of, after high school, dedicating 10 years of your life to missions, and the idea of like not pursuing the type of educational experience that your parents might expect was a very difficult hurdle to play it down very lightly. And so even while my family was, is Christian, is Adventist, my mom still works as a teacher in an Adventist school, for example. It was the kind of thing where it's like, do your part, like do the right things, but also like there's a real world in which you have to kind of live in and operate through. So I think that when it comes to my immediate family, I think everyone would agree I'm kind of maybe more on the, maybe their words would be like extreme or radical side of things. Committed, I don't know the right adjective is there, but I certainly spend more time thinking about these things than I think most of my family members do.
Nice. I appreciate you sharing that, in that tension of the family expectations and how ministry works into that. I know I can relate to that myself, in that straight out of high school, I ended up working for a church for a time. And I remember just like
Oh,
the look of horror on some, like, you're a smart kid. Why are you throwing your life away? So I appreciate you talking about that. And I'm sure culturally there is just an increased layer there that I appreciate you sharing. Well, I want to turn the corner a little bit, and it fits in with that idea of expectations. But we talked earlier about the shift that your channel went through and how it was, pretty different and bringing in a lot of people of different viewpoints. And perhaps, you went from preaching to the choir to talking to a different audience. I want to know, in effect, how did the choir react to that? What was the kind of reactions you were getting from people when they saw this new direction the channel was heading in?
yeah. I think in many respects, the choir is still trying to figure out what's happening. Um,
Yeah,
I think a good number of my subscribers kind of grew up for several years with me being some version of like what to aspire to. Like, and of course, like what I do online is only a caricature of who I am. It's not like the
sure.
full like, but in the sense that like, oh, this is a young person who cares very deeply about his faith and how it interacts with his relationships and, and studying the Bible, like all these things. And then all of a sudden, like hard pivot to something very different where I'm sitting down and give quote unquote, and this is not how I view it, but this is how I think people interpret it, quote unquote, like giving my platform away to people who believe in abortion and atheists and pagans and Mormons and like things that are just like so out of the box, gay people, for example. And it's just like so many people, I think, interpreted it like from the lens of betrayal. Like there's this guy who we trusted and followed and maybe even like used his content in our Sunday school or at our small groups or that kind of a thing, and all of a sudden now it feels like he's, I don't know, sold out or just caught up with this liberal agenda, or like there's all these kinds of catchphrases that get thrown around all the time. And so I think that at the core, some people have understood kind of what I'm going for and can read between the lines and see what's taking place. Like I appreciate you because it seems like you very much see the heart of what we're going for, even if some of the details and the language might be difficult to nuance through. But the reality was there was a big cost to that,
Yeah.
a large drop in support and viewership and engagement and all those kinds of things. And I think we're still trying to quote unquote recover from that. But it's okay. I understand that I was not in this stage of my faith journey a couple of years ago, and I wouldn't be ready for the kind of content that I'm creating now. And so I do my best not to judge people for not being ready for what I feel God is calling me to create and to kind of showcase. I get what it's like to be in your kind of bubble, and when you're disturbed from that, to feel somewhat violated. Like I understand that deeply, and I'm sympathetic to it. But on the flip side, I've seen so much positive from it. I've seen tremendous stories in person, in real life,
Yeah.
and also through the internet. I'm hearing stories of impact of how it's changing people's perspectives and how it's changing their relationships. And it's a very rich and rewarding thing to be able to be a part of.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate just sharing both sides of that there. And I get that for people that, change is hard. And I remember
Yeah.
being so impressed when you announced what you were doing, that you were going to change direction, because I remember, like I said, I grew up watching your videos and it's like, this is what it looks like to be a successful Christian YouTuber. And he's willing to follow the call of God in a different direction, knowing that, it could pay off big time or it could not. But it seems like the deciding factor was really, I feel like this is what it looks like to be faithful to God and the mission that he's given me. Like, this is what he's put on my heart, and that you followed that there. So I really appreciate that. And I think the people who watch my videos are going to absolutely love your videos. So again, we talked about at the beginning, we'll talk about at the end, but be sure to check out Justin's channel. You will really, really enjoy it, and it'll stretch you in a good way. And I think today, so often, in the past, we could talk about being sheltered because you didn't have experience to the outside world. And today with the internet, you would think that in a way, oh, well, now that doesn't happen because you can connect with anyone. But often I think we get into these even more echo chambers that our YouTube feed is all people who look like us and think like us and believe like us. And I really appreciate you challenging people to step outside of that.
That's so astute of you to be able to recognize the fact that echo chambers exist more so now than in the past. And I think this is something that is lost on a lot of people. We like to believe ourselves to be intelligent and rational and well evolved socially and mentally. Like we think that we're good when it comes to these kinds of things. And yet it only takes one relationship. It takes one story really to dismantle that belief. And that's kind of the journey that I know that I've been on, and many of my peers, the people who care about similar things to I know that this is kind of our experience collectively. It's that, oh, actually the world's much more nuanced. It's much more challenging than I thought. And we're starting to kind of peer behind the curtain with documentaries like The Social Dilemma that are kind of highlighting the very fact that it's in every company's own interest to leverage the algorithm in a way that keeps you kind of in your circle. And with very limited outside exposure. It actually makes them more money. And so what happens is that the divide between us and them, however you define us and however you divide them, it just becomes wider and wider and wider. And, maybe this isn't a problem under other worldviews, but under Christianity, this is a massive problem, to those of us who are given the ministry of reconciliation, right, of being able to bring people together. This is huge. Like if we can't speak to each other without like blowing things up, if we can't listen to each other, if we can't have civil dialogues and understand where we're coming from, like what power does our witness have? It's not lost on me that one of the labels that Jesus was described as, and this is for me aspirational. I think that if I could have something written on my tombstone, this is what I want written on my tombstone: friend of sinners. People hated Jesus because he was hanging out with prostitutes and he's hanging out with tax collectors and the Gentiles. That's a lot of isms that still exist today: classism, racism, sexism, everything else. And he was willing to cross those lines for the sake of people. And I think much of the church experience that I was exposed to was afraid of that and was more likely to say, hey, let's just hang out in our little castle, pull up the drawbridge and keep everyone safe, rather than going out there and exploring this dangerous and unknown world, because who knows what could happen. And yet when I see Jesus, this is exactly what he's been doing.
Amen. Man, that is so good. And you're right. I think today, if people weren't familiar with the Bible, they might think, calling a Christian, if you took like a prominent Christian pastor and were like, oh, he's a friend of sinners, people might think they were using that in a derogatory way. And people might say something like that in a derogatory way. But this is what it looks like to follow Jesus. And I imagine you have nuance there, and that you mentioned, there was times when you might not have been ready for this content. And I can look back on my journey and think about things that I've done that maybe I wouldn't recommend to everyone. Like, I don't think I've ever even mentioned this on my channel, so this will be news to everyone. But I spent a couple nights in a Buddhist monastery in Seattle, actually, so not too far from you. I wouldn't recommend that to everyone at every point in their journey.
I'm just curious, how do you set something like that up? You just call the monastery and you're like, hey, can I hang out for a couple days? What is that? Because actually, that's something I'm deeply interested in. Last year, Emily and I, my wife and I, for our kind of celebration of our 5-year anniversary, we went to Bali, Indonesia. And what I found was my favorite part of the experience was actually hanging out with our guide, who was really well versed on Hinduism. And his father was a priest. He was training to become a priest. And so I just got to ask him 1,000,001 questions about what it's like to be a Hindu priest. And I kind of felt like I wish I'd spent at least a couple days of my vacation just like in the temple, shadowing their priests and seeing what they were doing and documenting that. And so like when you tell me like, oh, you've been with the Buddhists, like you told me before things started that you hung out with at a mosque, like I'm thinking back to my world religions class in college, that when I went to a Sikh temple, I was like, that was a fun experience. I learned a lot, I felt like. And so I want to do the Buddhist monastery thing. So walk me through that. How do you do that? How do you set it up? And what was that like?
Yeah, so the story is probably not as exciting as it sounds. It started out, it was before I got super interested in this, but I think was probably an impetus to it. I mean, I guess there's a backstory to it. But anyway, I I really like traveling by myself. I love traveling in general. And I wanted to go out and do Seattle and Vancouver. And I was actually just looking at Airbnbs, and it popped up on Airbnb that you could stay at this Buddhist monastery in
That's
Seattle.
genius.
And it was like one of the cheapest places, and it was right downtown. I mean, I stayed on a cot. It was, not the greatest accommodations, but there was a shower. There was a place to sleep. It fit my budget of hardly any money. And yeah, it was a really interesting experience. Looking back, I wish I would have taken a little more advantage of the opportunity to dive in, but it was kind of from that. And I forgot to mention this when we were talking beforehand, but the slogan "Love Across the Lines" that this channel has really adopted actually came from a series I preached at a high school ministry, and they wanted me to teach a series on Christianity just in light of world religions. And I told them I'd only do it if I got to go and meet with these people, because I didn't want to characterize them, and I wanted to have these conversations. That's how I ended up at the mosque and everything. And then I ended up changing the series, not because I became like a pluralist in the midst of it and didn't care,
Sure.
but I wanted to talk about how we love across the lines. And the tagline, or the bottom line, I always like to make them rhyme. Shout out to Andy Stanley, taught me that. But like when we draw lines in the sand, we put hate close at hand. Because when we define people as us and them, we dehumanize people, and from a distance, we dehumanize, we can hate caricatures, but it's really hard to hate someone you're across the table from. And so that's kind of how all this started.
I resonate with that so deeply. It's actually one of the reasons why, like, even in the middle of COVID, one of the values of my show has been to only do interviews that I could do in person. And so something that, like, you may not see very well represented in the content is that every time I do an interview, I actually spend an entire day with the person.
Wow.
It's not just like I show up for a call. It's not just like even I just go there for an hour. It's like we're actually hanging out for several hours. Like a lot of these people invite me into their homes to meet their partners or to explore their city. Like we go and share multiple meals together. And I definitely have found that when you share and when you break bread together, right? Like there's something that happens in that experience. I was just actually doing a follow-up yesterday with Matthias Roberts, who's someone that I've hosted on my show many times over the last couple of years. He's a queer person of faith, fully affirming as a Christian. So I know that that's like already like, whoa, hold on. Like, I don't know where your audience is coming from, but that might already be too much information. I don't know. Sure. But one of the things I asked him was like, why do you keep coming back to these conversations? You know that I already disagree with you on these things. You know that on the internet, people are going to have all kinds of interpretations and hate given to the fact that you exist and say nasty things. Like this is just unfortunately part of the cost of doing business. Why do you keep showing up these conversations? And he said some version of, most of the time my answer is just no. Like I won't open myself up to these conversations with anyone. He says, but for you, for some reason, the answer is always yes. And like that to me spoke volumes, because in the middle of our tension of disagreement and a difference in beliefs, whether it's religion or politics or whatever the case is, he was able to see past our differences in the same way that I hope to see past our differences and to see a human being, someone that's worthy, someone that Jesus loves, and someone that I can love as well. And so to me, like the fact that I've been able to hang out with him on multiple occasions is such a crucial part of the work, is being able to be in that same space with a person. And I think that matters tremendously. And Christians were so afraid of doing it. Jesus didn't seem to be afraid of that. Jesus hung out in bars. Like he hung out with all kinds of unsanitary, quote unquote, types of people, like he was about it. And I don't know how we got so far away from it, but I have found that as I do that, it's a lot harder to hate someone and it's a lot easier to love them.
Wow. That's so beautiful. I love the way you put that. And it really comes out in your interviews, because I watch a lot of interviews on YouTube and they're so sincere, and it seems to be such a connection there. And yeah, your interview, I just watched it the other day actually with Matthias, and
awesome.
Such a warm interview. And I love that you're able to make that, like you recognize in that conversation with him that you were just mentioning outside of it, like, why do you do this? Because you know that there's disagreement. And I think that's where people oftentimes, and I get it sometimes in my comments, and I'm sure you get it, of they think that it's a compromise on truth to hang out with people you disagree with. And where we ever got the notion that to see people as human means you agree with them is just such a sad thing in general, that we think that somehow we can't affirm someone's dignity and disagree with them, which I think is a real just temperature check of where we're at. But I love that you're able to hold both of those.
It's ridiculous that we've equated those two things, because the incarnation traffics on this idea. Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us, lived among us. But that's not an endorsement of sin in our lives. That's not an endorsement of our rebellion against God. No, all it is simply one thing and one thing only. It's an endorsement of our value. It's our endorsement of our humanity, the very fact that we carry the imago. And when I say humanity, I don't mean like fallen humanity. I mean humanity for what it was originally created, to carry the imago Dei. When Jesus spends time with people, it's not an endorsement of a lifestyle or a practice. It's just simply the fact that you matter and he sees you and he loves you. And so minimally, like the whole story of salvation hinges on that fact. And so if we want to be able to see salvation played out in a person's life, we must be willing to start with that fact minimally, to say, hey, you matter. Like, your life is important. And even if we see things differently, I want you to know that you're loved by God, like as you are. Like, God loves you right now and he cares about you. It's not like you got to change things before God cares about you. No, he loves you right now. And maybe the easiest way for you to believe that radical of a truth is that maybe God right now wants to love you through me.
Wow. That's so good. And I love the way you tied that into the incarnation. And I think that is the very nature of love. And we see that in God himself, who has been forever a community of love. It pours out into creation. And love it has that quality that it's always going out. And yes, there is a place for us to have those times of retreat and engagement. And I don't know if you're familiar with him. Mark Sayers has a great book, Disappearing Church. He has a podcast with, he's out of Portland, Bridgetown Church. John Mark Comer. Yeah, they have a great podcast together. But he talks about this in his book, Disappearing Church, that we need to have this aspect of, we can have a time of, retreat, but it has to be retreat in order to engage. And that as a church, when we become so isolated that we're only focused on that retreat, how do we be not of the world and completely get out of the in the world aspect? That's when the church ceases to be relevant, if you will. And I think as we move into a more post-Christian culture, we don't have the benefit of just saying, well, everyone come to us, we've got it figured out, and until you're like us, you can't come. First of all, it's not going to work. Second of all, I should reverse the order. First of all, that's not how Jesus did it. That's not what we see in his life. And second, that might have worked in the 50s or in the 1800s when we were doing revivals and whatnot. I don't think that's going to work for the church today. And we're not going to grow in our faith. And you mentioned this at the beginning, which I think is so important. People think that when they engage with people who are different than them, it's going to deteriorate their faith. And maybe if their faith isn't ready for that, maybe there is an aspect and a level of discernment to that. But you mentioned that was actually when you began reaching out in evangelism that your faith grew. And so often that's what happens. Our faith grows as we put it into practice.
Yeah, I think so. And there is a healthy degree of caution that I would encourage people with. Like, maybe your faith does get broken down, but maybe that's not even the worst thing. Like, if your faith is so fragile that it literally can't handle simply the proclamation of someone who sees the world differently than you, then really, is your faith all that valuable? Is it really that secure to begin with anyways? I think the very fact that we treat even having a conversation with someone different with such a great degree of skepticism shows how fragile we are when it comes to faith. And maybe this is really a call for pastors and teachers and leaders to do a better job when it comes to this. Maybe it's a challenge for individuals to take ownership of their faith journey. I don't know really where the buck stops when it comes to this, but just a simple fact, your faith is never strong if it's never been checked.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to believe something simply because I've never researched anything else.
Yeah.
So here's what happens is that if you go on this journey, your beliefs likely will change, but in that process, they become stronger. And so, I mean, maybe it was, I don't know, 2 years ago, I made a video it was kind of a clickbaity title, but also not clickbaity. It was a video titled, I Was Wrong About God. And
Okay.
the kind of overall premise of this wasn't like, I hate Jesus and Christianity is evil and wrong. Like, that's not the point. The point is this, is that as a person of faith, as a follower of Jesus, I have to believe at least one thing, that God is infinite and I am not, which means that it's actually impossible for me to fully grasp and fully understand God, which if you
Yeah.
extrapolate, that means there are beliefs that I have about God that are wrong. That, when I get to meet Jesus face to face, he might want to, he's like, hey, by the way, Justin, it was this, not that. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. The problem is right now in the middle, I don't know what I'm wrong about. If I knew what I was wrong about, I'd change my belief already. But if I have a predisposition that everything that I believe about God is already correct, then that actually kind of makes me God. That's kind of a blasphemous way to live your life, that me as a finite person can understand the infinite. Like, no. So I have to walk with a degree of humility, knowing that there are certain things that I believe to be true, certain things that I might even boldly say that I know to be true. But there's a lot that I need to be very flexible on and be willing for God to teach me. And God teaches in a multitude of ways. He teaches through scripture. He teaches through community. He teaches through stories. And so just being willing to say, all right, God, I'm going to follow you where you call me. And even if it's maybe painful at times, I'm willing to re-examine things because I know that you're teaching me.
Yeah. And I think that comes down to an aspect of being more devoted to Jesus than to being right about our conceptions of Jesus. And that's going to sound scandalous to people. And what I'm not saying is that we're just going to be wishy-washy on doctrine. In fact, I'm having a guy on at the end of the week who just wrote a book called Finding the Right Hills to Die On. And I think there's an aspect of, there's things that we say, hey, like, this is really important. And like you said, have the audacity to say, like, I know this about God and I'm not going to bend on this. But I think often, and I think it comes from a couple places. I think there's a little bit of pride. I think there's also a little bit of insecurity, that when we're not sure about our beliefs, we make them all unshakable in an attempt to kind of overcompensate for the fact that we're not sure. And then it creates a house of cards. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we get in a lot of trouble there.
Yeah. One of my mentors told me, one of the things that we need to be able to do well is to not major in the minors and not minor in the majors, right? Like this idea of like having a hierarchy of what truly matters. Certain things, non-negotiable. Gospel, obviously, Jesus, obvious. Like there are certain things that are unmovable, unshakable. Like this is central. Like you cannot not believe these things and in good faith consider yourself a Christian or a follower of Jesus. There are other things that are just like a matter of preference, that are a matter of tradition, that maybe are even good practices, but not at the center. So I'll give you an example. This is an insight into Adventism, right? Within Adventism, there is a very rich tradition when it comes to like healthy living. Adventists have been featured by National Geographic as one of the blue zones. In fact, the only blue zone within America. And a blue zone is this place, a concentrated group of people that on average have a much longer lifespan. And, so blue zones are where people live past 100 years old, with a great deal of certainty. My great aunt, for example, passed at 105 or 106, woke up one morning, like, I think I'm good. She wasn't sick. She wasn't depressed. She didn't fall. She just woke up and said, I think I'm good. Stopped eating, died in her, and just went to sleep the next day with her entire family around her, singing and praying. Like it's a beautiful way to pass. Wow. She lived to be 106. And one of the tenets of Adventist kind of health practices is the idea of plant-based living. Like we go back to Genesis and say, hey, in the original design, God deemed it where it was, plants that you were to eat. And it wasn't until much later that we started to eat meat as a concession because God destroyed the world in the flood. This is kind of the theology underpinnings of it.
Okay.
But as a result, Adventists have a very big emphasis on vegetarian, if not actual vegan, like living. This isn't a religious, it's not a religious rule. You can certainly be an Adventist and eat meat. It's not a big deal. I grew up eating meat as a kid, but there's a tradition around it. And an example of people majoring in the minors is I had a friend at one point who was like, I will not marry a woman who's not both vegetarian and has the ability to cook vegan food. It's like, you might be putting your priorities in the wrong place, buddy. Like maybe it's a good value. Like it's something that you find, fulfillment in. It's something that you really want to aspire towards, like all good. But maybe when it comes to having a life partner, there's other things that matter more. And like, this is kind of how I feel the way that the church treats a lot of its dealings with people. It's like one of the things that shouldn't be movable is the value of a human being. Like, amen. That's what the cross speaks, is that our value is literally paid for with the blood of Jesus. And so anything that we do that undermines the value of a human, even if it's the way that they vote, even if it's the way that they worship, even if it's with where they put their genitalia, like if we start to dehumanize people, like we're already off the thing that matters most. There's other things that matter. Like I love looking at your video playlist or on your YouTube channel. Like you're crossing over the lines, Protestant and Catholic. Like there's a lot of really interesting and fun debates that we could have about that, but those are not at the center of what matters most. So let's not be like my friend, the Adventist, who's like, I'm never going to marry someone who can't cook good vegan food. It's like, well, maybe you just learn. Like maybe it's okay to go to cooking class together. It's not a big deal. Let's focus on what truly matters.
That is so well said. That was really interesting also to hear about Adventism. I had no idea about that. And I meant to plug this earlier. I always love pointing people towards other people who are doing great work. And I believe you actually showed up, and many people make the very generous comparison of my channel with his, but you showed up on Matt Whitman's channel, the 10-Minute Bible Hour, when he visited an Adventist church, right?
Yep, Matt's a good friend. We've known each other for several years now. Really? And so yeah, we've had a lot of conversations about. He's actually someone that I don't know, Matt, if you ever see this video, I don't know, like awesome, like I love you already, and that I care about you in a very high degree. But I've never told him this to his face. In many ways, I consider Matt to be like a mentor figure, a pastoral figure, maybe even like a pseudo fatherly type of figure. Like I'm workshopping right now a video idea where it's like new parent asks for first-time father advice or something along those lines from men that he respects or something along those lines. And I'm thinking of people that I want to like actually invite advice in my life. And Matt's one of these people. He's exceptional. I can't give a higher praise. He's the real deal. I've got to meet him in person on a handful of times. Like he's a great guy. And he's also really stinking good at Star Fox. If you've seen his podcast, No Dumb Questions, there's this bit where he's like, like what would you be willing to bet your soul against? And like he has this like jokingly tongue-in-cheek thing. He's like, I'd be willing to challenge the devil one-on-one in a game of Star Fox. I'll put my soul on the line and like I'll win this or whatever the case is. He's stinking good at Star Fox. Like I think his soul's okay. He could go into that bet all right. But yeah, like, okay, I'm so curious. How did we get here again? I just went on like 8 tangents in a row.
No, it's all good. I love it.
They compare learning about Adventism. Yeah. So he came to my home church and got to meet my pastor and asked a lot of fun questions. And yeah, I appreciate his work. I appreciate your work in discovering and exploring other faiths and other traditions and really seeing the best in people, not the worst.
Wow, that's awesome. And I had no idea you guys were so close. Maybe this video will get him to respond to my interview request if you watch this, Matt. No.
I'll put a bug in his ear. Actually, funnily enough, before we jumped on Skype, I actually already sent him one of your videos. I texted him.
Oh, really? Well, so there you have it.
Maybe he'll take a look at it. Maybe, I don't know. He's got like 8 different shows that he runs, so I can't speak for him. But
yeah, I'm sure he's a busy man. That's awesome. And if you sent him one of the tour videos, I believe he's linked, and I give him a shout out at the end of that interview section saying, if this reminded you of someone, that's because it reminds me of them too. But that's awesome. Justin, this has been so fun. I could do this all day. I want to kind of start winding it down to respect your time. But before we go, I want to ask this question because I feel like there's probably people who if they've been watching this and just hearing your heart for this, and then if they go and watch your videos, they're going to be inspired and think, man, like this really is something important. And they've heard the way you talk about Jesus and the way he was a friend of sinners. And they're thinking, man, I don't see this in my life, but I want to see it. But maybe they're just not sure where to start. What would you recommend for someone who feels like, yeah, like the echo chamber person, that's me, and I want to do better, but I don't know what to do?
Yeah. Yeah. Such a good question. And for that person, man, what a fun journey to be starting on. I think that's just gonna be so cool for you to be able to really lean into. Like I've jokingly kind of workshopped in my mind like a seminar, because I get invited to speak at conferences and things like that every once in a while, how to share your faith or whatever the case is. And I've thought about like, how do I share my faith? Like, what would I give an answer to that would like actually communicate, I think, a deep amount of truth, but also kind of just be like jokingly an answer. And my answer would be like, go get a haircut. And like, it really is that simple. Like it's the truth that I think it communicates is that you don't have to do anything special or go out of your way in order to be used by God. Just the simple willingness and the openness to God to say, hey, wherever you want me to be, like I'll be, however, like whatever, like just already acknowledging and trusting that God is ordering your steps, I think really is enough. Like the reality is that we don't pursue people. God is the one who pursues them, and he just happens to work through us here and there. And so I think the biggest key is just being open and willing. I don't think you got to do anything special. Like I knocked on over 100,000 doors, right? Like I shared that part of my life. I don't think you got to go knock on a single door. I think it's a lot simpler than that. Just show up in people's lives. Go get a haircut. Next time you go at Chipotle, instead of having your AirPods in, how about you just talk to the person in front of you? We were at a store the other day with some friends, and the lady is like, can I take your order? And my friend's like, hi, how's it going? What's your name? And the person must have been having a bad day or something like that, because she just responded like, why do you want to know? Like really defensive and like kind of like with a sharp kind of cut to her words. And my friend's like, well, because like we're here having this exchange and you're giving me this burrito, and I just kind of would love to know who you are and just kind of, like have this moment. And she kind of like in the entire interaction, she's looking down. She never looked up once, but you hear her mutter kind of under her breath, but loudly enough that it had effect. She said something to this extent of, no one ever asks my name. We treat people so transactionally that when you choose not to, it stands out. So when you get a haircut, like if you're there and if you're present and you're not distracted by your phone, like you can actually have the opportunity to really enter this person's life in a meaningful way. If you go to Chipotle, like that's an opportunity as well. Not every opportunity is a home run. That's not what I'm trying to say, but like it could have been.
Yeah.
Talking about Matt again, I don't want to just like completely build Matt up to be like this superhero among men, but like this was actually one of the stories that has really challenged my view of the world and how I interact with it. We were talking on the phone one day and he's like, hey dude, real quick, I'm going through this drive-through real quick. Instead of just hanging up and calling you back, can I just put you down real fast? Like, yeah, no problem. So he puts the phone down, and I actually get to overhear his exchange with the person at the drive-thru. And I forget exactly the words that were used, but I remember how it made me feel. And I thought, my goodness, like Matt is a savant when it comes to connecting with people. And if you listen to any of his content or his shows or whatever, like there's this sense, but it's like, yeah, there's a skill that he has in helping people feel seen and heard and valued. And I felt like that was what was happening as I'm listening to this conversation. And so they have this exchange. He drives off from the drive-thru, picks the phone back up, and he's like, "Oh, so sorry about that." I'm like, "Dude, no way! Like that was worth the price of admission, as far as I'm concerned." He says, "Funny story. Like I've actually been going to the same drive-thru here in this small town for some time. I don't know if it was months or years or exactly how long it was, but he's like, I've been intentionally coming back here over and over and over. And the person that who was taking my order, I've actually like been able to build a relationship and a friendship with them. And like kind of like the capstone experience, like that solidified. It was like they got married, her and or he or her, I forget if it was a man or a woman. This person got married recently and didn't know any church people, but because of our connection through the drive-through, she knew I was a pastor of the local church. She knew I was this and this and this. They actually started attending my church. I think he said I got to baptize them, and they invited me to conduct their wedding. I'm like, holy crap, like here's a dude who's going through the drive-through, seeing people for who they truly are with their inherent value and worth and treating them as such. And it has it has that potential. And I was just thinking, man, how many times have I gone through a drive-through? How many times has someone knocked on my door? How many times has a telemarketer called me? How many times has fill in the blank? And that was what was available, and I missed it because I wasn't even looking for it. Yeah. And it was actually because of that experience, maybe not solely, but like that was one of the key experiences that really caused me to enter into these like transactional relationships with a new frame of mind. I think in no small way that affected how I interacted with Chico, my barber, who I guess I'll just give the spoiler alert of like 4 episodes on my channel. Not only did I get to like hang out with him and interview him as a pagan, like full stop, like that was super fun. But a year or 2 years later, had the opportunity of baptizing him. We got to baptize his mother. We got to baptize his fiance. I actually got to conduct the wedding service of him and his fiance. Like we're super close friends. Like we still keep in touch all the time. Like we go hanging out. Like me and my wife hang out with him and his wife. We just like hung out literally last week. Like it has been one of the most rewarding and meaningful friendships that I have. And the way that I got there, much less like the whole salvation and gospel thing, but just a friend, was because I went and got a haircut. Wow. So like if you're wanting to have that experience, know that that's on tap. Like God's offering that to everyone. You just got to be willing to follow where he leads. Don't be afraid to step into the unknown. If I could give a piece of advice, like see people for their inherent and created value. Too often we've been conditioned by the media, by the world, by even the church to conditionalize value. You are valuable if you have 1 million followers. You're valuable if you got the nice car in the house. You're valuable if you've got the nice 401k. Or within the church, it's just as toxic and just as bad. You're valuable if you pray and read your Bible and study this, if you pay your tithe, if you attend church, if you vote in this one party or not, like even within the church, if in fact it's probably more pronounced in the church. I see the openness and the willingness to accept people no matter their background actually more modeled in the world than I do in the church. And that's a problem. So lead with value. See people for who God created them to be, not the lie upon which they're living under in that moment. And as you see that and as you speak that, you'll see life spring up in the midst of them, and you'll see God do something beautiful. And then just hang on for the ride, because who knows where God will take you from there.
Wow, Justin, thank you so much. I so appreciate that. And I know so many people are going to be blessed from hearing that. And I love the simplicity of it. I mean, gospel simplicity, it's in the name, but the idea of the way that just seeing someone, asking their name, talking to your taking your AirPods out, putting your phone away, it could really change someone's life. And it might not always change their life, but it might change their day. It might change that hour. And at the very least, it's going to change you, because you're going to be a person that sees people. And that is so beautiful. Thank you so much for that. It has been an absolute joy and privilege having you on today. I just want to give you the mic real quick to let everyone know where they can find you, because I'm sure they are, if they haven't clicked off already to go to your channel, I'm sure they're getting ready to.
Awesome. Well, first, before that, Austin, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to bring me on. I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously, and I think that you're doing something awesome. The care with which you approach these subjects and the wisdom with which you craft the questions, like just you're doing a great job. I'm excited to follow your channel and to learn more about what you're doing. And I want to wish you the best success moving forward with everything that you do.
Thank you.
That being said, my YouTube channel is just youtube.com/Justin Khoe, JustinKhoe. I'm on all the social media at jkhoe, JKHOE. And yeah, on my channel, we have explicit conversations about belief and the stories that shape them. Kind of what I intend to do with every show is to kind of challenge the bubble that I grew up with, the conservative Christian kind of audience that I've grown and been a part of, by exposing us to different worlds, different worldviews, and how does someone get to the point in which they are at that point. The goal is not to convert someone. The goal is not to change their mind. The goal is to see them as valuable. The goal is to build a relationship, to build empathy and compassion for that person and the people groups that they could possibly be representing in that moment. But minimally, it's to build a one-on-one relationship and connection with the person that I'm sitting across the table with. I think that this matters. I think this is something that will be interesting. I'll just say that it's been the kind of project that has changed my life. It's challenged me in very many ways. I don't say any of that lightly, but it's all been good. And I'm really excited to see what God continues to do with it. So if that sounds like something that interests you, we'd love to have you on board. Let me know that Gospel Simplicity sent you over. I'll be happy to connect with you.
That's awesome. Thank you again, Justin, so much. Be sure to go check out his channel. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know I don't take that lightly, and nor does Justin. So thank you so much. And until next time, be on the lookout for more videos. And as always, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.